This is a presentation of OneLogin training.
Welcome to Configuring Windows Domain Authentication, Part 2. All right, so there are 5 main steps that you will need to perform in order to fully configure Windows Domain Authentication, other than, of course, having Active Directory connector instances in place. First, there are going to be a few changes we need to make through the OneLogin admin UI. Then we need to make sure that users' Windows identities are being passed through the browser. Third, if you want to still have users provide an additional authentication factor, you will need to make sure that their security policy that requires that additional authentication factor, i.e. MFA, is checked. Next, you need to go through a few steps to actually configure SSL. It's more than just specifying that port 443. Again, remember, SSL is required if you want to enable load balancing between the Active Directory connector instances, which is, again, a best practice. And then finally, there is an enable checkbox that you want to check back over in that OneLogin admin UI. This will make sure that the feature is turned on for all your users. Okay, so now that we have our environment, again, set up with Active Directory, let's go to that first step and look at the changes we need to make through the OneLogin admin UI. So again, going to the authentication menu, choosing Windows Domain Authentication. And at the top of the page there, we do see an enable checkbox. But remember, we're going to hold off on checking it until we finished fully configuring WDA, so we make sure everything is in place. So what we need to do here actually right now is simply fill in the IP addresses that OneLogin would detect when users from within the Windows network are browsing to the OneLogin portal. Because again, basically, this is what tells, like when a user's request is coming from one of these public IP addresses. And again, you can specify a range there. When it's coming from one of these IP addresses, that's how OneLogin knows to go through the WDA authentication process versus prompting a user for their username and password. Next option down there is a little checkbox, ignore X-forwarded for header IP option. Again, if you use a proxy or a firewall service like Zscaler, you want to check that checkbox. And we've got a few other checkboxes like include mobile devices, include Mac devices, and honor user policy MFA configuration. So the only one that is checked by default is the include Mac devices. Again, those Mac devices would have to be joined to your Active Directory domain for that to work. And then you can choose whether or not you do want to support WDA for any mobile devices that also might be joined to the domain. And there's that honor user MFA policy configuration. Again, idea is your users might have user policies that require MFA when they're logging into OneLogin. But by default, when they're being logged in using Windows Domain Authentication, which is what we're configuring here, by default, it doesn't honor that MFA requirement unless you check the checkbox here. So it'd be a combination of things. You'd have to have the checkbox checked here, honor user policy MFA configuration, and there'd have to be a user policy that applies to your users that requires MFA. Then your users will be prompted for MFA. We'll take another look at this later on in this course. And then finally, down there at the bottom is the only other step or configuration setting that we have to make on this page. So, the ignore X-forwarded depends upon your environment, include mobile devices, include Mac, honor US. Those are all sort of choices. But specifying IP addresses, that is required. And then you also have to choose how you want to handle the authentication endpoints down there. There are actually 2 options. One is using the Active Directory connector. The other one is a scripting option. 99.99% of the time, you will want to choose that Active Directory connector option like I have checked down there. And the drop down shows you which Active Directory connectors you have configured for your environment, because again, only one of them can be enabled to process Windows Domain Authentication requests. So 99.9% of the time, you're going to check off that Active Directory connector checkbox down there underneath authentication endpoints, and then choose if you have more than one Active Directory connector. Basically, you'd have more than one Active Directory connector if you have more than like one forest, Active Directory forest that you're syncing with usually. So choose one of those through which WDA will actually be processed. Once you do that, you want to save the changes here, and then you can either click on where it says Go to Active Directory, way down there at the bottom. That's actually a hyperlink. That will take you over to your Active Directory connector configuration page, or you can simply navigate to Users, Directories, and click on your Active Directory connector. So here we are either way. And over here, we want to click on each one of our instances. So where it says ADC and ADC2, those are our two instances of the Active Directory connector being installed on two separate member servers within this Active Directory environment. And you will need to configure each one of them. So you might only have two, which again, best practice, minimum have two. You might have more. You'll have to go and open up each one. So click on each one, and you will want to set what is called their desktop SSO redirect URL. Why is it important to know old names? Well, because you might see it every now and then. So you need to configure that text box down there at the bottom of this configuration screen called desktop SSO redirect URL. What do you need to put into that text box? Well, again, we are going for the SSL configuration, so we use https:// and then we want to specify that internal fully qualified domain name. So that's like that full name that that member server gets inside that Windows network when you set it up with Active Directory. So hostname dot whatever the Active Directory domain is, basically. In this case, dc.onelogintraining.com. Then :/1login/IDP. So basically, same URL you're going to configure for each one of these connector instances. The only thing that will change will be that internal FQDN value. So now let's check out how to make those changes we just mentioned. All right, let's see all that it takes in order to enable Windows Domain Authentication. At least we'll start off the basic configuration steps here. So, authentication menu, Windows Domain Authentication. We do have a handy dandy little enable checkbox here. I am not going to initially check that checkbox. I want to make sure actually most of my configuration is in place before I force everybody to use this, because otherwise I might have users logging in and then they're going to get redirected and not be very happy. So first thing then that I want to start looking at is going to be these IP addresses. These are going to be those public IP addresses. So like, what does my computer appear to in the rest of the world when I'm out browsing the internet? So it's not really an IP config kind of result. It's more like I go to the browser and I type in what is my IP kind of result. So in this case, this is the public IP address of this particular machine, which happens to be part of my Windows network. So I'm going to copy and paste this over here. Now, of course, in your production environments, it's probably a range of IP address that you've been assigned when your internet was all set up for your company. It's those IP addresses. So in this case, I have the one machine that I'm going to be demonstrating on, and I'm just going to put its IP address in here. Now, for the most part, that's all I have to worry about right there. I'm going to scroll on down, though, to authentication endpoints. So this is where I need to specify that it's going to go, really the communication is going to be handled by my Active Directory connectors. Now, there are alternate methods. There is this little fixed URL for a remote authentication script option down there, and that is used maybe 0.01% of the time for off-roading as far as you're concerned. Some sort of weird requirements. Maybe you have only certain machines, certain types of machines that you want Windows Domain Authentication to work for. And so you need to kind of test to see if they're logging in from those machines first. That might be something you'd use that script for. Not a script that you guys can write. It would be something that you'd have to reach out to our professional services to help you with. So for our purposes here, we're going to focus on the 99.9% of the time when you are using the Active Directory connector. So whichever connector you're primarily going to connect through, that's the one you're going to choose. You can only choose one connector. If you have multiple forests, you're going to have to set up domain trusts between the forests for it to work from forest to forest. But this will cover an entire forest if I have my Active Directory connector set up that way. So I'm choosing my Active Directory connector there, and then I'm going to save these settings. I need to go to the actual connectors themselves and specify those URLs. So the URLs take the format of, in this case, because we are going to be setting up for load balancing, HTTPS, and you can see I might have configured this already. And then the fully qualified domain name of the server it's on, the Active Directory connector software, wherever I install that software, it's fully qualified domain name. So in this case, it's dc.onelogintraining.com. Going through port 443 there, and then it ends in the OneLogin IDP. And I'm going to save that. Oops, I did not save that. Go back in there. There we go. Just select and save. And then for my other connector, because again, we're configuring for load balancing, so that means I have to have the Active Directory connector installed on at least 2 systems for this to work. So I am going to use HTTPS, and then the host name of this guy is member. And again, his fully qualified domain then is member.onelogintraining.com, and again 443 OneLogin IDP, and continue. So I've got the initial configuration settings here. I've got IP addresses set up. I told it it's going to go through the Active Directory connector. I've configured those endpoints. The trick now is actually in configuring those SSL certs, and we're going to look at that next. So there are a couple more options on that WDA configuration page. One is that fixed URL for remote authentication script option we mentioned earlier. Again, only used if you need to configure a non-standard authentication flow for WDA. And if you need it, you'd actually have to engage professional services to help you out with that script. So just an FYI there. Now, at the bottom of the page is an option for auto create new users. It's a little weird option because if you think through it, right? Active Directory connector is all about configuring it so that you're syncing users from Active Directory to OneLogin. So why over on the WDA configuration page would I need this auto create new user option? Well, it's kind of a safety net. In certain environments, they might have a very large Active Directory forest and might not have fully configured it or correctly configured it to sync all the users from all the different domains within that forest. So this little guy, basically, safety net, helps to auto create those users when they first log in using Windows Domain Authentication. So if you check the checkbox, if the user doesn't already exist, it will create that user. Now, when we do create users, we normally want them like assigned to like a security policy, like through a group, or we want them assigned to at least a role so that they're getting access to certain applications. So, there is an option there at the bottom such that if you check the checkbox for enable, then whatever role is listed underneath default roles at the bottom, that will be the role that they get assigned to. If you want something a little bit more complex to happen, like look at their username and based upon some sort of attributes, assign them to, again, maybe a group, that's to a security policy or to some other roles, then you can also check the checkbox for apply mappings. But if you don't check the checkbox for apply mappings, as long as you enable auto create new users, they will be by default assigned to whatever role is specified there underneath default role. All right. Okay, so next main step is then to make sure that the user's Windows identity is passed through to the browser so that OneLogin, the ADC, can ensure that the user is logged in basically from their Windows desktop with those Active Directory credentials. You have two options for configuring this. One is to use Internet Explorer, which is this first one that we're looking at here. The other one is to look at group policies, to use Active Directory group policies to push this change out to all the systems. We'll look at that next. So Internet Explorer, again, I'd have to make this change on every single workstation, so it's not the most efficient option, but here's what the option is anyway. So if you choose to use Windows Explorer, do need to make sure you're running with administrative privileges. So open up IE, say with admin rights there, and then click on that gear or settings icon in the upper right hand corner. Choose Internet Options, select the Security tab, select Local Intranet, and then click on the Sites button. Click on the Advanced button. And in the add this website to the zone text box, type in basically that internal FQDN. So that same URL, except for the port number and the /OneLogin/IDP part, the same first portion of the URL that we specified in the desktop SSO redirect URL option over on our Active Directory connector instances. That's what you want to type in here. So it's basically, again, internal FQDNs of the servers you have installed the Active Directory connector software on, or my ADC instances. You will want to add in an entry for each one. Here you can see I used HTTP and HTTPS. In production, you would choose whatever you're configuring for these guys. I just wanted to show both examples here. So again, HTTPS is going to be the best practice option when you are configuring SSL and load balancing. And that is what we are working towards because we are showing you what the best practices are for Windows Domain Authentication. So best practice, use HTTPS. And again, add it in for each one of those Active Directory connector instances that you have. So in my environment, I've got two systems I've installed the Active Directory connector software on, DC and member. And thus we see dc.onelogintraining.com and member.onelogintraining.com here. Once you finish, click close. Okay, you're done. But again, have to go through this on every workstation. So mo better option is to use group policies, right? Again, group policies allow you to push out this change to all the computers within your domain. And you could do this by modifying the default domain policy. So launch the group policy management console. You're going to right click on default domain policy, select edit. Up pops a little group policy management editor, and you're going to expand on down underneath computer configuration, administration tools, Windows components, Internet Explorer, Internet Control Panel, security page. So once you select security page, which you can see down there sort of on the left towards the bottom, then you will see some details popping up over on the right-hand side. Look at those details and select Site to Zone Assignment List. You can see it down at the bottom of the list, or so in the middle of the page, over on the right-hand side. Double-click on that. When you double-click on that, you will want to make sure it is enabled. By default, it is not configured. So make sure it's enabled. Then click on the Show button, and here's where you put in those URLs. So those same URLs that we were just talking about, putting into Internet Explorer. First part of the URLs that we specified for the desktop SSO redirect URLs. That's what we're putting in over here. So again, my environment, I've got dc.onelogintraining.com and member.onelogintraining.com. And again, we are working towards the SSL configuration. So they are beginning with HTTPS. So the URLs are going over on the value name column, and then for each entry, my value I am assigning to them is 1. 1 matches to the intranet zone. So I am basically saying, put these guys in the intranet zone. Okay. Now, default settings, by the way, for any sites that are put into the intranet zone is it will automatically pass through whatever you logged into the workstation with. So automatically pass through your Windows identity. However, just to make sure, extra special sure, that these guys, again, that they're going to be seeing that Windows identity, there is an additional change that we will want to make through group policy just to make sure nobody like manually wants to override this setting. So again, through the group policy management editor, where we just made that other change, way down towards that security page, underneath security page, we're now going to select intranet zone. So basically expand everything that we had before. Now we're just selecting one of the folders or items underneath security page, intranet zone. And we have a whole bunch of new options over on the right hand side. Now you might want to click on the setting column to sort these guys because there are an awful lot of them. But from that list on the right hand side, choose logon options. Double click on it. Guess what? Enable it, just like we did to the other setting. And all we're doing here is just choosing an option from those logon option drop down there in the options box. So default that's selected is automatic logon only in intranet zone, which again technically would work, but maybe you decided to put these sites into a different zone for some reason for your environment. Maybe you have different security needs. So all we're going to do here is just make sure automatic logon with current username and password. So it's, again, ensuring basically we're passing through that Windows identity. And then we click OK. And once we've made our group policy updates, it should refresh on the systems in a certain period of time. But if you want to make sure that this gets applied, you can do a GP update force. Now you'd have to go out and do that on all your systems, but GP update force will ensure that the group policy is being applied at that point in time. But there is an automatic refresh for group policy changes. So within the next, 30 minutes or so, all the systems should get the update anyway. So now let's take a look again at how those group policy changes are made. So let's check out how we can make sure IWA kicks in. So let's take a look at, again, where we can go and make sure that Windows credentials are passing through the browser. So first place that we can go to is Internet Explorer here. Again, I'm going to go to the settings, Internet options. I'm going to go to my security tab, select local intranet, sites, advanced, and this is where I would add in those URLs. You can see actually on this system, they're already there. And in fact, it's grayed out. This is actually showing me that these have been set through a group policy, which again is a much better idea. I mean, instead of having to go to every separate machine and make these changes, to simply apply it at a really high level using group policies. So group policies I would do by going over to, well, stop that. Go over here to my server manager and I can launch my group policy management tool from here. Go in, right click this default domain policy and check out the settings. So trick is obviously just kind of knowing where I want to go navigate to. It's going to be policies. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Come on. There we go. And scroll this out. There we go. All right. So I want to go to, again, administrative tools, Windows components. I'm going to move on down here till I see Internet Explorer. And then underneath Internet Explorer, I'm looking for that Internet Control Panel. And underneath Control Panel, I need Security Page. So the first setting where I'm adding in those URLs is done from the Security Page container over here within the group policy. And what I'm going to be looking for over on the right hand side is that site to zone assignment. So a lot of options sometimes on these sides, so sorting helps. And here is site to zone assignment. Notice I already have it enabled, but if we go in, we can see it's enabled. And if I click on show, this is where we can see that I set those options. Again, most environments, all you're going to worry about is like just the HTTPS or just the HTTP. I'd added both in for demo purposes. But key thing is these are basically those URLs that are pointing to the systems we installed the Active Directory connector on. And the value means that they're being put into the intranet zone. That's what the 1 is equivalent to. You can kind of see an explanation about that over here anyway in the actual settings panel. So I'm going to say okay. And I've completed that particular step. The other one where we want to make sure, extra special sure, that it's passing through whatever they've logged into the workstation with. Make sure nobody has overridden that option because, you know, people can be tricky in life, is to go to the actual intranet zone settings itself and go to these logon options. And again, I can say enabled, and I am going to choose automatic logon with current username and password. Click OK. Now, technically, again, by default, since I've added them to the intranet zone, default setting for the intranet zone is to pass through those credentials. So I don't really have to do that step, but it's a nice safe step to do because it means they can't override it on their own machine. So they can't mess it up. So that's basically what I need to do. Again, after 15 or so minutes, it ends up refreshing automatically, or I could do command line GP update force on my machines and it'll force it to basically pull in that change from the group policies. So again then, now remember that by default, MFA is not enabled actually when a user logs in through WDA. That checkbox there that says honor user policy MFA configuration by default is not checked. So if you want your users to be prompted to supply their MFA when logging into the OneLogin portal, when they are using WDA, you need to check the honor user policy MFA configuration and make sure that, of course, their user policy, whichever user policy applies to them, also requires MFA. So just checking the checkbox doesn't mean that MFA is going to pop up. Their policy also has to be configured for requiring MFA, and of course they have to make sure they've registered an MFA device. So MFA should already be working for the user basically. That checkbox just makes sure that it will work for the user when they're logging in using WDA. So let's take a look at how that login flow looks when a user logs in, say, without the MFA, and they're logging in through WDA, and how it looks with MFA. All right, so in order to demonstrate the relationship between MFA and WDA, I've got a few different windows open here. I've got one browser session open. I'm logged in as a super user in my OneLogin account. I've got OneLogin Protect over here on the right so we can see when MFA kicks in. And I've got a remote desktop session here to a Windows system where my test user Gloria is logged in with her Windows Domain credentials to this Windows Domain join system. Thus, if Windows Domain Authentication is enabled, she should automatically get logged into OneLogin. So first, what we want to demonstrate is that if Gloria logs in from outside the Windows network, that she will be prompted for her credentials. Logging in from a Mac. Mac is outside my Windows network. It's not joined to that Active Directory domain. Therefore, Gloria is getting prompted for credentials, and she has a user policy that requires MFA. So we can see that she is getting prompted for MFA. When she accepts, voila, she gets logged into the OneLogin portal. So normal login flow is she is required for MFA. However, when she logs in from her Windows desktop, where MFA is been enabled, I'm not NMFA, but where Windows Domain Authentication has been enabled, right? Little checkbox here has been checked. We've done all the rest of the steps necessary to configure this guy. When she logs in from this machine, Windows Domain Authentication kicks in, and she will not be prompted for username and password, nor is she prompted for MFA. Her normal login flow requires MFA. Why is she not prompted for MFA here? Well, it's because of the default setting here. This honor user policy MFA configuration is not checked by default. So we are going to check it. And click Save. So this policy that applies to her, which is the one that, in fact, is called Require MFA. Now, whatever settings are required here, in particular, these MFA settings over here, OTP required, whatever authentication pieces required, this is what's going to kick in for her. Okay, so let's make sure that she is fully logged out before we go test this out. So we're going to do a little force log out there. You can see over in her activity, she was doing a little force log out. In fact, by the way, you can see some of these fun things where you can see, you know, here she was logged in. Which is the one here. This should be my W. Yeah, see here you can see like desktop SSO, JWT. That's what logged her in. Anyway, all right. So now let's go back to this Windows machine. Again, remember, we have now checked the checkbox requiring that MFA be applied when she is logging in, even through Windows Domain Authentication. The policy that applies to her, again, does require MFA, OTP auth required. So what we should see now, when we try to log into the OneLogin portal, and we spell it correctly, is that her username and password will get passed through automatically, but she should get prompted for MFA. So again, default, it wouldn't have prompted. Had to go in, check that checkbox. She is now prompted. This concludes part 2 of configuring Windows Domain Authentication. Please continue on to part 3.
This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.